Hey everyone, that Norse Pagan guy here. This video is the first installment on a video series I'm going to be doing covering Norse paganism and basically just the general outline of the religion and different things you need to know when diving into this religion for the first time. This video we're going to be covering who the Vikings were and where the word Viking actually comes from, ideas on why they traveled and where they traveled, and just some of the basics about that and some of the theories. The Viking belief in destiny, the Norse belief in valor, and different sources that I personally recommend for people who are new to the religion, who want to read up on lore and just some general basic knowledge. And two of those books are right behind me, which we'll talk about later. And a couple of issues we have with chronology when it comes to the stories and the Eddas and different things about the gods. Alright, so first off, who were the Vikings? Now, the Vikings were primarily a group of people who went raiding in the 800s-ish through the year 1000-ish, depending on what sources you'd like to believe. Now, but historically, those are about the time frames. The term Viking actually comes from the word Vikinger, which means to go raid. And so that's kind of where that comes from. It's very simple terminology, but most people who actually went raiding were not professional fighters. A lot of them were farmers or just kind of peasants with some experience who would go on these raiding missions. Now, depending on who you were and where you lived and stuff like that, there were many different reasons of why you could have gone a Viking. And a few of those reasons will be covered right now. So the first one would be overpopulation sustainment. During this time, there could have been a larger boom in population due to the recession of the polar ice caps, and this allowed more people to actually, survive in climates in Scandinavia and Norway, and so populations were actually starting to increase, and due to poor farming conditions in Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia and all those different kind of places, it was not sustainable to keep all of those people alive and keep all of them fed, especially through their long winters. So they would go and to raid other places to get their food and their resources to be able to sustain the people who are living there. That's one of the theories. Another one is an advancement in technology. This one has some good basis to it as well. Around the year 750 through 800, the development of the long-range sea-bearing ship was created in Norway, and people were able to actually take these further over to where we'd call England and Ireland and Iceland, and even all the way up into northern parts of Canada, where we had found some evidence of Viking traders going there and setting up shop there for small periods of time. Now, this has some good basis in it because a lot of these people were not, again, professional fighters. So they would have gone on these missions to try and trade, to try and make friends, make allies, not necessarily to spread religion. Like, that might have happened a little bit here and there, but that was not the intent. This was really to go and make progress and try to bring resources back and maybe even spread out and go, hey, maybe, it's overcrowded here. I can't really get any land to farm, so I'm going to head over to this island, England, or I'm going to head over to Ireland, or I'm going to head over to Scotland, or wherever these other places were, and I'm going to set up shop and I'm going to set up a farm there. So it really was a lot of opportunity to go places that no one had really been before from those nations, and so it really opened up the world to them, and they just wanted to take advantage of it. Finally, one of the biggest ones, especially this one's true especially towards the later years, like the 900s up until the year about 1000, would be Christian persecution. So during this time, a lot of Christianity, especially after they landed in England and things like that, Christianity really started to creep its way across Europe and start creeping its way up into Norway and Scandinavia, and this was a response to that. So during these times, Christianity, it's not really a secret, they weren't really friendly about their conversion tactics. And so they would go on these raiding missions to either get payback or, defend their honor and their valor and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and just basically pay back what was due, as they felt it, to the Christians. And this really did open up the world to them a little bit, especially along the coastal areas of England and Germany and France, especially England and France, brought a lot of that anger with them and to go raiding in those areas, and they just brought gold and stuff back and food and everything like that, like they would on the first raiding missions for resources, but that was more of an added bonus instead of the actual reason why they would have gone. Now, we're going to talk about destiny. If you've been in the religion at all, or you've done any kind of digging into the religion, you'll know that, especially in the earlier years, and especially to the 800s, the history we have of the Norse pagans back then, the heathens, the Asatru, whatever you want to call them, destiny was extremely important. Now, this can be shown in a lot of different resources we have. Good examples of this would be Odin, and him taking all of the heroes, or half of all the fallen heroes, with him to Valhalla to help him fight in Ragnarok. All of the things he's done to try to prevent Ragnarok from happening, and also the death of Balder, and the way that Frigg was trying to stop that from happening. Now, destiny is extremely important because the three Norns are what string, or I guess carve the fate of all humans in the world, and they're the ones who decide who lives and how long and how they die and things like that. Now, one big thing you'll notice within Norse paganism, you especially see with the Eddas, like with Odin, it's not necessarily that you can change your fate, but how you get to that fate is up to you. And that's one of the big things that leads into valor, which we'll talk about next. And destiny is basically the three things that are holding the religion, I guess the people within the religion, accountable, because there's not anything you can do about your future, but you can change how you get there. And the names of the three Norns are Urdur, Verdandi, and Skuld, and they live underneath Yggdrasil by Urd's well. And they are both good and evil. It kind of just depends on the sources you read and how they're presented at the time. And it is important. It is important because you can kind of see the mindset of the people of this time, right? If someone was going a Viking for their first or their 100th or their 1000th time, and they realize that, hey, this time I'm destined to die, they aren't going to back out. They're not going to try and be scared. They're not going to try and do things like that if they really hold that destiny to them. And they're going to act valiantly. They're going to try and become the most valiant warrior they can be in that moment, to hopefully get chosen by Odin to go to Valhalla, to be able to fight in Ragnarok one day. And in modern cultures, it's not necessarily true that most or all of us want to go to Valhalla. That's actually kind of a touchy subject we can discuss in a different video. But for warriors, the ones with the warrior mindset and the ones going into battle thinking about this, that would be one of the goals that they had at that time. Whether it be their end-all goal, most likely not. But at that moment, that would be their end goal. If they found that to be their destiny, they would do everything they could to get there. Now that we've discussed destiny, we can look into valor. Now, valor is basically the acceptance of one's destiny. It's finding one's destiny and then walking into it with open arms. Whether or not you agree with it, whether or not you like it, that is your destiny, and it's you accepting it and then moving on into it, whether it be dying in battle and going to Valhalla with Odin, or dying in battle and going with Freya to Folkvanger, or it be you battle 100,000 battles, kill hundreds of men, thousands of men, whatever, and then go home and die an old man at your farm. Whatever it may be, valor is truly the embracing of one's destiny. And like I discussed earlier in the video, not everyone, especially in modern times, wants to go to Valhalla. Valhalla has been kind of Christianized and as being like a heaven, and a lot of us don't really want to go fight for the rest of eternity. The other option would be Helheim, and that's where a lot of us see our destiny as being, since we're not warriors, we're not fighters, we're not these big valiant men going out and going into battle day in and day out. A lot of us know that our destiny is most likely going to end up in Helheim, and so we embrace that. We know our valor, we have our valor, and we walk into this open armed and prepare for our futures instead of trying to find all these different ways to fight or find excuses. We embrace that we're going to go to Helheim one day, which isn't a bad thing. We'll cover that in a different video. Helheim isn't what you think of with the Christian hell. And we look at this and we accept it and we move on. So that would be a good way of modern interpretation of valor. Finally, this leads us to sources. Now, what sources do we primarily use? Well, the first one would be archaeological evidence, whether it be Mjolnirs found in Norway and Scandinavia, whether it be images of Freyr held in king's castles and king's palaces and things like that, whatever you want to call them, longhouses, to show that kings often prayed to Freyr, where a lot of the common folk prayed to Thor, or if you even look at ancient Scandinavian and Norwegian cities that are named after Odin, and different gods here and there. You can definitely tell which gods were most important during which times, and you can start to figure out how things might have changed over time. Now, other research we can do would be looking at the two different sources behind me, and the first one we're going to talk about is the Prose Edda. Now, this is just the copy I own. There's multiple different translations you can use, and the Prose Edda actually dates back to 13th century Iceland. The author Snorri Sturluson, he was a Christian monk, priest, he was very important in Iceland, and one thing he was very keen on is poetry, and ancient skaldic poetry, to be precise. And he was really starting to see the decline in interest for a lot of poets and priests and monks and stuff like that. And so he wanted to write down everything that he could, or at least that he thought was important. And you can definitely see some of the Christianization in here, but for example, in the very beginning, in the prologue, it starts off, "In the beginning, Almighty God created heaven and earth." So you can see a little bit of stuff touching in there. But at the same time, it's by the 13th century, Norse paganism had basically died out. There weren't many people, if any at all, still practicing the religion. And so it would be a lot like me going up to someone and talking to them about a lot of the other kind of religions that existed way back then, like ancient Egyptian. I'm not going to go up and go, this religion isn't correct, right? Okay, I just wanted to make sure so that way you don't think I actually believe in ancient Egyptian stuff. No. They believed it as storytelling, kind of like how we have videos about Hercules and Achilles and all these different ancient Greek myths. We don't necessarily believe they're true, we're just telling their stories, and that's kind of what's happening in the Prose Edda here. Now, often Snorri's Eddas are called the Younger Edda, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but because a lot of the stories are dated back to earlier times, so he didn't hear them in the 13th century and then write them down. These are stories that have been passed orally from decade to decade to decade, and even talked about in the written down in Younger Futhark. There we go, Futhark. That's the word. Again, I'm not a linguist, so I don't really know how to say a lot of these things, but I'm working on it. I'm getting better. And anyway, back to this. Snorri wrote these down just because he wanted to preserve them. He wanted to keep them in time, and that was probably one of the only saving graces we have for a lot of the information kept in here. And it does have, again, some Christian influence, but for the most part, it's pretty sturdy on talking about a lot of the myths. Now, you're not going to find anything in here about how to practice or what different gods to worship for what, but you are going to find at least some baseline information about a lot of the gods and a lot of the things like that. Now, I would recommend, and this is going to sound a little weird, but reading it backwards. So the three different parts are the Gylfaginning, the Skull part of the Small, and the Hatal. The Gylfaginning is the most common chapter within this book, due to the amount of the information that's discussed between King Gylfi and the gods, the three gods he's talking to at that time. The reason I suggest reading this backwards is because I first heard it from the author of the next book behind me, Jackson Crawford. He is a linguist who studies Old Norse and Scandinavian, and he dabbles a little bit in Icelandic, but he has thoroughly read through this book. He's working on a translation right now, and unless it's already published, but I haven't seen anything on that. He talks about his going through and his translations of it, and he finds that the way that modern authors are putting this book together is backwards compared to what Snorri would have, I guess, wanted, with the way this was translated and the way all of this works through. Now, back to Jackson Crawford. We're going to discuss a little bit of him and a little bit of his work. The next one I want to cover is the Poetic Edda, and this is, again, just Jackson Crawford's version, the one I own. There are many different versions of this out there, so please look around and ask your friends, ask YouTube, look at different sources, and figure out which one you think you like the most. The reason I tend to like this one the most is because he adds a lot of different notes and a bunch of different subtext within here that helped me understand when I first came into the religion, and he also has his translation of the Havamal, which is another good intro book, but we'll cover that in a different video. Now, this one's usually called the Elder Edda, and because the stories found in here are from what we'd call the Codex Regius, that is a collection of poems and stories and Eddas that is actually older, believed to be older than the one that Snorri actually based his book off of, because of we were able to tell this by the language that's used, the way it was written, and things like that. Now, the reason that was written before this one is because the Codex Regius wasn't actually discovered until the 17th century, and it holds 29 poems about Norse myths in here, so it's a really good collection if you really want to start diving into some of the basic and some of the more attested to myths within the stories. Now, the existence of the collections led scholars to believe that Snorri was working with older manuscripts, so he might have had some influence from the Codex Regius and had his own version of it, but there is no evidence to show this. We unfortunately don't have any of the materials that Snorri Sturluson was working on or working with. We only have what he had written down in the Prose Edda, so unfortunately we're kind of lost in the weeds here on that one. Now, one thing about this, Snorri is a lot less blunt. He beats around the bush a lot more. He goes into a lot more detail. This, pretty blunt. Straight to the punch. Here are the stories. Here are the Eddas. Here's what they're about. Get reading. Now, that can make it a little more difficult to read if you're not used to it, so I definitely recommend reading the Prose Edda first, whichever copy you decide to get, and then hopping into the Poetic Edda so you can kind of get an understanding of what you're looking at. A lot of the poetry that it's written in is a little more difficult to understand because it doesn't follow traditional verse that we see today. It follows Old Icelandic, Old Norwegian, whatever was written in originally, and it doesn't flow like we see a lot of the stuff flowing today. So be careful. Be careful and read slow and really try to comprehend it. Don't be afraid to read it 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20 times if you have to. I've read each of these more than a few times. So you'll start getting into it. You'll get a first grasp, then you read it again. You'll pick up some things here and there. Just take your time. This religion's called the religion with homework for a reason. So just take your time, work at your own pace. Don't overwhelm yourself, and just enjoy it. Enjoy the stories. Once you start picking up how things are written and how you can actually start diving into this, you'll really pick up on it and enjoy yourself as you're reading the stories. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about was discrepancies in timelines. You'll see some things in there where it talks about Odin talking to this person, but you're like, hold on, 2 stories ago this person was dead. How is Odin talking to him? Or you're going through and you're like, wait a minute, didn't this happen like 200 years ago? Why is this happening here? I don't understand. Norse mythology is not a structured religion. And that's one of the things that's harder, especially if you're coming from Christianity or a monotheistic religion or a really structured religion. It's hard to understand. This is not a very structured religion. And so there are different things that kind of stack on top of each other that might not make sense. And one of the biggest reasons for that is because of how widespread yet excommunicated from each other these people who practice this religion were. They didn't necessarily have one set true religion where they'd show up every year and be like, okay, this is what we found out, this is how we're going to make things written, and that's that. Different communities, different towns, even different families had their different versions of every story, and these are just the versions that survived. So we might have gotten a pluck of information from a family or a village that just happened to be written down in like the 700s, and then 920 AD we get another thing from a different part of Norway over here, and then they smash the 2 stories together. And while they don't necessarily make sense, they kind of give us a grasp of how this religion changed over time and changed by location. Well, that covers everything we wanted to cover in the first installment. We went over who the Vikings were and where the word Viking comes from, destiny in the Norse religion and why it's important, and how it ties into valor and why that's another important thing within the religion. And then finally we covered some sources that I personally recommend, as well as some of the history behind those sources and a lot of the discrepancies that we find. As you go through, you'll figure out more of what I'm talking about. Now, next episode we're going to be covering a few more things. We're going to start really diving into things a little bit, so I hope to see you back next episode.